Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a real privilege to speak alongside such distinguished speakers, and my warmest congratulations to Hanna Millerova, Monika Fajgrolova, and everyone else at the class for their excellent work, including putting together today's event. Although the contribution of fossil fuels producers, garment industry, or other economic sectors to climate change has been well documented, global climate change initiatives have been preoccupied with legal regulation of governmental rather than corporate conduct. So while it is well understood that in order for the Paris Agreement goal to be achieved, businesses need to proactively reduce their carbon emissions, the formal addressees of any international legal climate change obligations have been states. And the sphere of corporate conduct has been left, or seemingly left, to initiatives based on voluntary participation, such as the UN-sponsored initiatives for engagement with non-state entities, such as the Climate Ambition Alliance or the Race to Zero initiative. However, just this May, in May 2021, a Dutch court held that Royal Dutch Shell, the parent holding company of the global oil and gas group, is legally required to reduce the CO2 emissions of its entire group by net 45% by the end of 2030 relative to its 2019 emissions. And the court ordered the group to do so. Now, this case was not an enforcement action by the government. It was not brought by the government to implement the state's climate change obligations. It was brought by a group of NGOs on the basis of a private law, civil law, cause of action. In the case, the Dutch court confirmed the causal relationship between production, limitation, and emissions reduction, and stated that although Shell cannot resolve the global problem of CO2 emissions on its own, this does not absolve the company of its individual partial responsibility, and the Shell group must use its control and influence to do its part. So this is admittedly a first instant decision, which I understand has been appealed. However, it is a groundbreaking decision in that it confirmed and enforced a legal duty of a corporation to reduce its contributions to climate change. Now, this judicial decision builds on a decade of developments in climate change science and in law, both at international and domestic levels, in an area which is today commonly referred to as business and human rights. And I would like to contribute to today's discussions by considering precisely these legal developments, this change in the legal landscape towards viewing, conceptualizing corporations as addressees, as recipients of normative requirements on their conduct in relation to their human rights and environmental, including climate change impacts, and including holding corporations legally liable for their contribution to climate change. Now, at the international level, in international law, the traditional manner of formal regulation of corporations has been, and this is typical of environmental law and climate law, including the Paris Agreement, the traditional manner of formal regulation would be indirect. So through obligations of states to legislate or take other measures vis-a-vis businesses within their domestic jurisdictions. This indirect regulatory mode matches this traditional idea of international law as interstate or primarily interstate. But the drawbacks of this regulatory mode are obvious. So dependence on state implementation and enforcement, which may lack or be suboptimal because of domestic politics, because of states' capacity to challenge, capacity challenges, or because of the real possibility that global businesses will be able to avoid pertinent regulation through corporate organization and structuring. The power imbalance between large multinational companies and many states has long been observed. And the sheer number, as well as the often complex and amorphous structure of multinational organizations, is almost overwhelming. There have been periodic, so far unsuccessful attempts since the 1970s to formulate an international human rights instrument which would articulate internationally legally binding human rights obligations for corporations. So instruments under which the obligation holder or bearer under international law would be a corporation, the business, not the state. The most recent attempt at such an international instrument is currently ongoing within the framework of the open-ended intergovernmental working group on transnational corporations and other business enterprises with respect to human rights. This open-ended working group was established in 2014 by the UN Human Rights Council with the mandate to elaborate an internationally legally binding instrument to regulate in international human rights law the activities of transnational corporations and other business enterprises. However, it does not seem that this attempt at formulating an international framework directly applicable to corporations will be successful either, as there has not been a sufficient consensus among the participating states to do so. And the successive treaty drafts adopt again an indirect mode of regulation. In fact, the very reference to the very mentioning of the term corporate human rights obligations has been controversial in certain states, including the EU, China, Latin American states such as Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Panama, oppose such treaty language and instead insist on a distinction being made at the terminological level between states' human rights obligations and corporate human rights responsibilities. So while the human rights-based approach to climate change has provided a powerful framework for challenging deficient or absent governmental policies on climate change, and the speakers this morning testified to the international commitments to to rights-based response to climate change and the significance of human rights paradigm to bring about change to climate change policies. The international human rights paradigm has been, at least at the international level, perhaps less productive in relation to corporate conduct and its impact on human rights and the environment, due to this central notion of human rights as involving the vertical relationship between public authority and its subjects. And so formally, this idea that formally there are no international human rights obligations of business, at least in international human rights law. Somewhat ironically, in other fields of international law, things have moved forward farther. So somewhat paradoxically, in terms of norm setting and the imposition of international legal obligations of corporations relating to human rights and the environment, it has been in international investment law and in investment treaties, where we would see an increasing number of treaties to contain provisions which impose obligations on so-called investors, who are typically business corporations, including environment obligations. So today we will have investment treaties, including treaties in force, such as the 2008 ECOWAS Supplementary Act on Investments, which will impose such legal obligations. They will use language of legal obligations such as an investor or an investment referring to the local special purpose vehicle, corporate entity, that an investor or an investment shall, for example, uphold human rights, or shall carry out social environmental impact assessment, or shall act in accordance with precautionary principle. So it does seem a bit ironic to bring up investment treaties as an instrument of human rights and environmental protection, because these treaties have acquired quite a negative reputation for often disallowing legitimate regulation in public interest. They have been known for this asymmetry between rights of foreign investors and duties of corporations. But there has been movement within that area of international law, arguably precisely because it hasn't been burdened by this long-standing debate about the concept of human rights and who are the obligation holders under human rights. So that said, still the human rights discourse and in particular the work done under the label of business and human rights has been shifting the boundaries of social and normative expectations vis-a-vis businesses in the international human rights area as well. And the central framework would be, in this respect, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which were developed by the special representative of UN Secretary General John Ruggie, and unanimously endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. Now, under this framework, it is reinforced that it is states who are the holders of any human rights obligations, but the UN guiding principles set out these three-pillar structures. The second pillar consisting of so-called responsibility of business enterprises to respect human rights. And this responsibility to respect human rights is understood to exist independently of any state obligations, and go beyond compliance with national laws protecting human rights or the environment. This responsibility involves the demand to avoid causing or contributing to adverse human rights impacts through own activities, but also it involves prevention and mitigation duties. So in formal terms, the UN guiding principles are not a legally binding instrument, but they have been actually extraordinarily successful in turning into the focal point on the subject and providing conceptual framework and language to think and talk about and demand redress for business related human rights abuses. The UN guiding principles are not the only international instrument in this area, but they have really been kind of game changing in the way they have reshaped the discussion. This has materialized in the Dutch case that I mentioned at the beginning, which was a case brought under Dutch law, under a civil cause of an unwritten duty of care of the Dutch Civil Code. But the Dutch courts, the Hague District Court, has very much relied on the UN guiding principles to interpret what was the content of this unwritten duty of care. In this case, the climate change contributions of Shell. So let me talk about this case, which has really been profound and has been an inspiration for similar developments in other jurisdictions now. So the Hague District Court again accepted or did not accept that Shell would owe the claimants any human rights obligations, but it held, and this was a conceptual basis for its analysis, that there is a widespread international consensus that human rights offer protection against the impacts of dangerous climate change. We have already heard this morning, but also that companies must respect human rights, and the Dutch domestic law must be interpreted in light of this international consensus. And the UN guiding principles were seen as an embodiment of this international consensus. And have led to the conclusion that there would be the reduction obligation on Shell to reduce the whole group's activities. The court said that this reduction obligation of Shell is a significant best effort obligation, that it includes not only the activities of the Shell group, but also its end users, so anyone who buys Shell's gas. And in this context, Shell may be expected to take the necessary steps to remove or prevent the serious risks ensuing from the CO2 emissions generated by its business relationship. And that it is required to use its influence to limit any lasting consequences as much as possible. So this really has been a game changer in this respect, which on one hand build on in terms of the evidentiary aspect on the Urgenda case. Maybe the stars have also aligned procedurally, because Dutch law would allow for class actions, and the Dutch court was prepared to identify a class which would have standing in the proceedings. It refused, however, to the claim that the class should be very broad. Maybe the citizens, everyone in the world or everyone in the Netherlands. They limited the class to a group of or inhabitants of a region in the Netherlands, the Wadden region. But still, it is a really profound precedent which we can expect will inform the developments going forward. So this would be kind of one of the end products of the business and human rights field, which, however, I would like to say has arguably created other legal arguments or developments which we can expect will impact any climate change litigation aimed at corporations. And here I would in particular emphasize the case law, which has been establishing the duty of parent companies for any adverse human rights and environmental impacts of their subsidiaries. So we heard this morning about the problem of extraterritoriality or the global nature of climate change and environmental harms. And in traditionally in domestic adjudication, the core principles of corporate law, of limited liability, corporate bail, etc., would pose a real issue. Because courts would not be prepared to say that a parent company should be, as such, held liable for actions of its subsidiaries around the world. However, again, a case brought against Shell by a group of NGOs in the Netherlands, the leading NGO is Milia Defensie, would succeed in actually bringing a merits decision which would stand for the proposition that the parent company owes a duty of care to the victims of the actions of its subsidiaries. And these developments have been mirrored in other jurisdictions, such as in the UK, where the Vedanta case and the Okapi case have stood for this very proposition. So now, in terms of domestic tort law-based claims, suddenly the barriers, the traditional barriers of corporate veils have been disintegrating by using the notion of duty of care as a vehicle to hold corporations accountable and legally liable for harm done to human rights, but also the environment. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.